In this video, we're going to explore all the tools that are in the toolbox and take a deep look at them. As I mentioned in the UI video, we've got our selection tools. There's three of them. There's the Select tool, there's the Lasso Select tool, there's the Paint Selection tool, and then we have our transformation tools, our Move, our Rotate, and our Scale. I know these are all pretty much straightforward type tools, but let's take a deep look at them to understand how they're incorporated inside of Maya LT, and also the transformation tools. I want to talk about their relevance and how they work with the attribute editor and the channel box. First of all, if I want to access the tool preferences, I can easily go to Window, go to Settings and Preferences, come down and choose Tool Settings. The Tool Setting dialog box will appear. I can bring it out, I can float it around, I can change its size if I want to, and whatever. It's going to give me the relevant preferences and settings depending upon the tool that I've selected. So right now I have the Select tool. If I click on the Lasso tool, you'll notice the tool settings changes to the Lasso tool, and so on and so on. Now, let me discard that. Instead of going to Window, Setting Preferences, Tool Settings, if I want to, I can just double click on any tool and that same dialog box will appear. So now I have access to the tool setting by just double clicking on it. Lastly, there's one more way of getting it. If we come over to the icons all the way over here on the upper right side, there's the second one in from the right. If I click on it, it says Show Hide Tool Settings, and they will be docked along the side, which many times is very handy. I may lose a little bit of my viewport real estate, but I don't want it getting in the way of my geometry or what I'm working on, so I want to have it docked. Let me hide that for a second, and just for reference, as mentioned before, but if you ever bring up any one of these windows and you want to dock it to the UI, just pick it up and move it, bring your cursor to exactly where you want to lock it in, and you'll see that the UI adjusted a little bit there. I release this and it will lock it into that position. But okay, let me get rid of the tool preferences or settings. I'll just get rid of them for right now. So the first tool is the Select tool, and guess what you do with that? Of course, we select different objects and components inside of our scene. Common knowledge is you click on something and it's selected. You'll notice that it's highlighted. It's highlighted in green inside of a wireframe right now. In fact, even if I hit 5, we're going to go to our shaded view. As I select any of my primitive polygon objects, the mesh will be highlighted in green, indicating that it's selected. Now I can hold the Shift key to add more to my selection. So I've got my sphere selected. I hold the Shift key and I click on my torus. It is now selected, but notice that the torus is now highlighted in green, and the sphere, which was highlighted in green, is now white. The green highlight indicates the most recently selected object. Let me deselect everything by just clicking in the view. You can drag a marquee to select something, and anything that falls within the marquee will be selected. So I can just quickly drag a small marquee, catching just the corner of the torus. It is now selected. If I drag again, I continue to drag the marquee so the torus is included and the sphere is also included, and both of those are selected. But if I drag my marquee across the cone and the sphere, not including the torus, of course the torus will be deselected, and these two objects are now selected. Now I'm not using any modifier keys so far. I've just been clicking and dragging, creating my marquee. And also just, clicking and dragging a marquee over nothing deselects everything. But let me select this torus, and again, I'll hold the Shift key. I'll click on my cone, so they now are selected and the sphere is not selected. If I hold the Shift key down and I drag my marquee and I include all three objects within the marquee area, you'll notice that the sphere is now selected, but the two objects that were selected are no longer selected. That's because holding the Shift key, holding that modifier key while dragging your marquee will deselect any object that falls within the marquee that is selected, and anything that falls within the marquee that was not selected will then become selected. Let me deselect all, and I'm going to select these two objects once again. And I'll do the same thing. I'm going to drag a marquee over all three objects, but I'll hold the Control key this time. I click and drag my marquee, making sure all three objects fall within, and I release. Everything is deselected. That's because the Control key will be used to deselect anything that was selected, but it will not add to the selection or select something that was not selected. So once again, I know I'm repeating myself, but I will select these two objects, I hold Control, I click and I drag, and when I release, the objects that were selected are now deselected, and any object that wasn't selected is not selected. So you can use Shift and you can use Control as modifier keys. That also works with just clicking and dragging. So if I select my torus, I hold the Shift key and I click and select the sphere. If I click on the sphere again, I can deselect and select it by clicking on it. I'm still holding Shift and I click on the cone, it is now added in there. Now if I hold the Control key and I click on the cone, it is deselected, but I can continue to click on that or even marquee while holding the Control key, it will not select the object. So using the Control modifier key is a great way to deselect different objects or components that are already selected without worrying about selecting other elements that you didn't want to select. And right now I've got 3 objects in the scene. It's not really that difficult to deselect or select these. But when you're working on components, when you're working on vertices and faces of the actual object and you're modeling or you're finessing something and you really want to be careful what you're selecting and not selecting, that's when the Shift and the Control key really come in handy. And you'll see that later when we talk about modeling in another video. But for right now, for example, I'm going to right click over my sphere. And instead of being in object mode, which I am right now, I'm going to tell it I want to be in face mode. Now you'll see the sphere changes color as far as its highlighted selection. And as I move my cursor around, you'll see any one of the faces that actually make up this object is being highlighted in red. And if I click, you'll notice that that face is now selected. If I want to add more faces to the current selection, I hold the Shift key and I start to click and I add more faces to this, right? But now what if I want to deselect these 2 faces right here? If I use the Shift key to deselect them and I accidentally touch some other faces, I'm going to be selecting them. And that's not what I wanted. I just wanted to deselect these 2. So let me hit Command Z to undo that. Now if I hold the Control key and I click and drag across those 2 faces, it doesn't matter if I accidentally include these unselected faces in my marquee. So that's really the benefit of using the Control and the Shift key as modifier keys when you're making your selections. All right, since we're in component mode right now, let's take a look at our Lasso tool. If I select that, and as you would imagine, I can click and drag and create a lasso around the different components or objects. Now, obviously, the Lasso tool works in object mode also if you're trying to select objects. Right now, I'm in component mode. I'm just referring to it because I'm in component mode. But you can also use the Lasso tool on your objects. And when I release the cursor, you can see what happened. The faces that were in my Lasso drawing became selected. And your modifier keys work exactly the same. If I hold Shift, I'm going to drag across these selected and unselected faces. And when I release them, you'll notice the faces that were selected are no longer selected. The faces that were not selected are now selected. And again, the Control key will let me deselect faces without worrying about accidentally selecting faces, just like the standard select tool. So I hold Control and I click and I drag, and it didn't matter that I accidentally went over or touched these other faces that were not selected. They're not going to be added into my selection. Okay, let's move on to our paint selection. Now, I will reiterate this, and I talked about this a little earlier. The paint selection tool only works on components of an object. It does not work in object mode. So let me step back 1 second. I'm going to right click over the object, my sphere. I'm going to go and tell it to go back to object mode. I still have my Lasso tool selected. If I draw a lasso around an object, it will be selected. Okay, so you can use your Lasso selection tool in object mode or component mode. But watch what's going to happen the minute I turn on my paint selection. I automatically go into component mode, and I'm currently at vertex mode. I can right click over the object and choose face. I want to be in face mode, back where we were a second ago. Now, with my selection, my paint selection tool active, I click and I drag, I can paint a selection. Notice that when I painted over the faces that were already selected, they did not become unselected. Okay, the paint selection tool works a little different. You decide, do you want to add to the selection or remove from the selection? Let's open up the properties or the settings for this. So I double click on it. The top options are for the brush size, for the upper and lower brush. You get different profiles and so on, but I'll expand this out a little bit. What I want you to look at is this. You've got this option called Paint Operations, and by default, it's set to select. And that's why wherever I click and I drag over or paint on my faces, those faces will be selected. If I activate unselected and I come in and I start clicking, you'll notice that I'm going to deselect. And even when I click and paint over an unselected face, it is not being selected. If I turn on toggle, this option will do what the other tools were doing, meaning I'm going to add the selection where it's not selected and deselect where it is selected. Now, it doesn't mean you have to go into these preferences and change which paint operation you're working on every time you want to unselect or deselect something. The Control and Shift key does come into play, but on an individual operation method. What I mean by that is if I go to Select, I come into View. Let me zoom in a little bit so we can see this a little better. If I paint, I'm selecting, right? If I hold Control, though, and I paint, I am deselecting. But notice that the faces that I'm painting over that might not be selected are not being selected. Okay? I release Control and paint, I start to add to the selection. Once again, I'll activate unselected. So by default, with no modifier keys, as I click and paint, I'm deselecting the faces. But if I hold Shift, I'm going to be adding the faces. So this tool works a little different as far as the modifier keys. It's not like you can use Shift and Control with either of the paint operations. When you're in select mode, you can use the Control option and it will deselect. In unselect mode, you would use the Shift key to then add to the selection. And then toggle is an either or. We're not going to have time in this video to go through every single option or preference that's available to you here inside of the tool settings. I wanted to just cover the main ones, which is the brush and the paint operations for the paint selection tool, because it can be a little confusing at first as to why you're selecting or unselecting the different components of an object. All right, let me close this, and we're going to get out of component mode. So I'm going to, first of all, activate the Move tool, and then I'll right-click over my object, and I'll tell it to go back to object mode. And then we'll make sure it's selected.